Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're very excited to be here. Thank you. We're glad you're with us and not listening to 30 vulnerabilities in 30 days. So as said in the introduction, we will talk to you and present research that we conducted in Guardicore regarding an unusual crypto mining campaign. We call this campaign Nanshu. And my clicking doesn't work. Okay. Perfect. So 50,000 MS SQL and PHP MyAdmin servers were infected by this campaign. The attackers used 12 different payloads throughout a time period of around 2 months that we've monitored this campaign. And most interestingly, the attacker used a very sophisticated tool set consisting of 2 Windows kernel exploits and 1 signed rootkit. My name is Ophir. I'm a security researcher in Guardicore Labs. I love reverse engineering, especially Windows executables and malware in particular, and I also love tweeting on Twitter about my daily findings and job. And since Daniel is my boss, I will let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Both me and Ophir are from Guardicore Labs, and after more than a decade in security in different fields of vulnerability research, malware analysis, and more, I call myself a security jack of all trades. And I'm somehow still a hopeless Windows fanboy despite all the flaws of this operating system. So.
Thank you. So, as we mentioned, we both work in Guardicore Labs. Guardicore is a data and cloud and data center security company based in Israel. We both work in Guardicore Labs, the research group of Guardicore, where all the fun things actually happen. So these include, for example, participation in academic research on network analysis and segmentation, and we do open source security tools like the Infection Monkey that you can later on Google. And my favorite part, of course, is the threat hunting that we do to find interesting campaigns on the internet. So what is the data that we base our research on? Guardicore deploys a network of hundreds of honeypots, or global sensors network, as you can see here. These machines are internet facing, but they block all incoming connections and redirect them to virtual machines that are created on the fly. These machines run either Windows or Linux, and to make these machines attackable, we configure them with various vulnerable services. These include, for example, old web servers like old PHP MyAdmin, database services, unpatched Windows, etc. We also patched a couple of management protocols, for example, SSH, SMB, file protocols like FTP, to make them allow login after a certain number of attempts. So with this case, attackers can feel that they actually attack a real machine on the internet and not just a honeypot. Once the attackers are inside the machine, we record everything that they do that we find interesting. So what is interesting? Process events like process creations, for example, network events like full packet captures, TCP, UDP, DNS resolutions. We record every file creation and deletion on the file system. We record every access to the registry, for example. And also for specific applications, we record application-specific events, like, for example, in databases, we record every query, we record every SSH command, FTP command, etc. Also PowerShell, for example. So with this very unique data set, we see many mass-scale server attacks. There are many reasons why attackers choose to target specifically server machines, and I'd like to talk a little about these reasons now. First of all, these mass-scale attacks require zero interaction. The user, or no user, no one has to click on anything, respond to anything. These are completely automated attacks. Also, servers tend to have very long uptime, so this raises the chances for attackers to hit an active machine. Server machines, as you can assume, they're very rich in resources that attackers fancy, like CPU, for example, for crypto mining that we'll talk about, large bandwidth for efficient denial of service attacks, and of course, servers host and store a lot of valuable data that attackers can steal and later sell on to other attack groups. These server machines tend to be those neglected machines within the organization, and they tend to run old operating systems and non-patched operating systems. Oftentimes, they face the internet where they really shouldn't be facing the internet because they serve the organization internally. And all these reasons make them a very good target for attackers to target and to make money in different methods. All these attacks share a pretty general attack flow that I will go through right now. The attacks usually start when the attacker performs a port scanning over several huge IP ranges to locate the machines that they find interesting. So for example, they're looking for 1433 for MSSQL, 445 for SMB, etc. They're looking for the relevant machines for their attacks. Once these machines are found, the attackers, oh, sorry, I missed something. Okay, I wanted to say that the attackers either use open source scanners that we all know, like Nmap and Masscan, but they oftentimes write their own port scanner. Once these machines are found, they exploit them in one of two popular methods, either vulnerability exploitation or credentials brute force. What we've seen very popular recently is the eternal blue exploitation. We see it in various programming languages like Python, PowerShell, C, of course. And also, as I mentioned, credential brute force still remains a very popular exploitation technique. Once the attackers are inside the machine, they do, of course, all the rest of the attack flow. They download additional payloads. They try to move laterally within the organization and infect even more machines. They communicate back to their command and controls, and you probably all know the gig. So now that we know how server attacks look like, we're going to deep dive into one of them that we saw in Guardicore, the Nanchu story, and I will let Daniel take it from here.
So in brief, I'm going to cover how this attack starts out, very similar to the template that Ophir described. Then I'm going to explain where this diverges from the normal flow. So as Ophir mentioned, we see a lot of attacks, roughly a few tens of thousands of high-resolution attacks per day. And obviously, we're not going to go over all these attacks manually, and we run some different basic queries to find interesting ones. And we saw a set of incidents coming from South Africa that attacked MSSQL servers, and they all had an identical attack flow. So far, not so interesting, but then we looked at the payloads, and we saw that these payloads include a signed Windows driver. Now, this is exceptional for many reasons, which I'll go into later, but this was enough to make us take a closer look at this attack flow. At a very high level, what happened in this attack is brute force credential stuffing to breach the database server. Then, using admin credentials, configuration changes to the server. Using these, they drop a file that is in itself a dropper, a downloader. They use it to download two files and execute them together. Now, that was really fast, and I'm going to go over each step and explain deeper. At start, they start out from a basic credential brute force. The first attempt you can kind of see up here is username SA, the standard MSSQL system administrator. And later on down, they use a username KASadmin, password vice. Just remember that, we'll go back to it later on a bit. And after some tries, our honeypot just lets them in. And the curious thing starts happening after they're inside. At the first step, they enable XPCMD shell. MSSQL has a variety of extension methods. XPCMD shell is an extension method that allows users to write queries that run shell commands, allowing the attacker to basically break out of the SQL Server rules. In addition, the attackers activate ad hoc distributed queries and OLE automation procedures. These two extensions are not used by the attackers, but for general knowledge, they can also be used to read and write files in registry. Using XPCMD shell, the attackers basically iteratively echo commands and append it to a file named 2.vbs. And looking specifically at the files, some commands, for example, we see a VB script web open get, argument 0, and also to write it out to a file. Basically, we have a VB script file that accepts a command line parameter of where to download something from and where to save it, a basic dropper. This is used twice, again with the same shell method, to download two files, apxp exe and 360 protect, and then they execute them. apxp runs as the program to be executed with the second as a parameter. What we did at this point was, okay, we have something interesting, and we start casting our net wider by finding more such incidents and searching for similar attack flows. What we did was obtain a set of source IPs, all the sources, and we found dozens of attacker IPs, and a small set of destination IPs, IPs where the attackers would download from. One of these connect-back IPs, as we term them, led us to what's basically a researcher's paradise. This is a screenshot from the attacker's pretty much wide open web server. It's an HFS file server, HTTP file server, and this gives us a full file listing containing binaries, archives, logs, scripts, and so forth. And this was very useful for us to understand the growth of this botnet. For example, we have timestamps that tell us exactly when a file was modified or uploaded. We also have download counts that tell us exactly how many times each file was downloaded, and this gives us a good proxy for the attacker's activity, as much as we can see what's downloaded a lot and track how many infections happened. But most interesting was a 20 megabytes file named trtl.rar that ended up containing most of the attacker infrastructure. And at this point, I'm going to pass the mic back to Ophir.
Thanks. So we took this turtle file and we unarchived it and then found a full hierarchy of tens of folders and files that eventually contained exactly 3 modules: port scanner, brute force module, and a remote command executor. Now all these operated as a chain where every module's output was the next module's input. So this kind of reflects the whole attack flow of Nanchu. And we'll see now how these looked like on the attacker server, the HFS that Daniel mentioned, and also how they looked like on our end, on our systems. So to begin with, the port scanner, we found the executable alongside a log file and a text file. And the log file showed exactly how this executable was run. So you can see the attacker is scanning for exactly 6 ports. We opened the text file and found these exact 6 ports, which are typical MS SQL ports. So the attacker is obviously looking for MS SQL servers on the internet. The executable itself was found on VirusTotal. It's detected since 2014. Probably not something our attacker wrote themselves. Once the port scanner finishes running, we have a list of MS SQL servers IPs, and this list was just passed on to the brute force module, as you can see here. This is the execution of the brute force module. The I flag represents IPs, and then we have -u and -p, which you can assume stand for username and password. And on the HFS server, we found lists of usernames and 200,000 of passwords that the attacker attempted in their brute force procedures. So we decided to compare those findings and how we saw the attack flow on Guardicore's platform. And we saw complete correspondence between the files used as usernames in password dictionaries and the exact brute force attempts that we saw on the platform. Daniel mentioned KAS admin before in Vice, and those of you who are pretty close to the board can see those used as part of the attempts. So at this point, our attacker has breached several tens of thousands of MS SQL servers. And the next phase is to execute commands on these servers, and this is what the remote command executor is for. All the files related to the remote command executor were found under a folder named chuan, which in Chinese means spread, infect, transmit, penetrate, and I found many other verbs with the same meaning for this Chinese word. Inside this folder were 3 interesting files. The first one was called USP10, which was very easy to find out. This is a benign Microsoft executable, interactive SQL tool meant to connect remotely to MS SQL servers and then execute commands on the server. Next in line was a log file named MSSQL, which I will later on talk about. And finally, there was an executable named jianting. We decided to do a simple static analysis on it. This is a screenshot from CFF Explorer that I opened the file with. And I found these Chinese strings, put them in Google Translate, gave me easy language program. Thank you, Google, very nice grammar. I understood this was easy programming language, looked up a little more, and found an entry in Wikipedia which states that this was a visual compile, multilingual, proprietary programming language. In easy words, this is a simple drag and drop language where you can just select UI elements and compile them into a Windows binary. So this apparently is what our attacker was using. Next in the lazy analysis, we ran strings on this jianting executable, and we found this line. It runs USP with some server address and port, username, and a password that the attacker already has at this point. So this is basically connecting to the remote server and executing all the contents of MSSQL log file, which is redirected to this command. So let's see what MSSQL has inside. The attacker seems like they're changing some configuration and enabling XPCMD shell procedure. And next down the script, we see how the attacker writes some file named 2VBS. This should look familiar to you at this point because we saw this at the beginning at the, on the attack flow that we noticed in our honeypot system. So at this point, we have two perspectives of the attack flow. We see them both on the attacker server, on the HFS, the turtle file, and on our platform. And we understand at this point exactly how the attacker targets these MSSQL servers. We have the port scanning phase, the brute force, and the command execution on the SQL servers. And now we'd like to understand better what is the attacker doing once they're on the machine. What are these executables that are downloaded? So the post-infection phase. If you remember, the 2VBS script ends when we execute two executables. One is the other's parameter. And we looked at all the hundreds of incidents that we gathered, and we saw that X was always one of two files, APEXP or APEXP 2012, where Y had a larger list of options to be one of. We looked up the APEXP file, and we found a publication from CrowdStrike dating back to 2014, where they stated this was a Windows kernel vulnerability in the Win32k driver. This was used in the past by a very large Chinese APT group, and its ultimate goal was to run the other executable with system privileges, which are on Windows the highest privileges possible. The APEXP 2012, we did not find any mention of this executable, but we decided to deep dive into the two of them to find the differences. So as I mentioned before, APEXP was already used in the past. It supported many Windows versions, and to be honest, the code looked very professional. This exploit is very weaponized and operational, and as I mentioned, supports many Windows versions. The unknown file, the only evidence of its existence we found in source code in some very marginal Chinese forum. And the code looked much less professional and resembled more of a proof of concept rather than an operational exploit. They also use different techniques, and I think what we can learn from here is that our attacker probably didn't write any of them, but rather collected sophisticated exploits from wherever they could find them to try to expand the number of platforms that the Nanju campaign can run on top of. To get a little technical sense of how the exploit operates, let's understand it a little better. So as I mentioned, this is a PE exploit, privilege escalation. The vulnerable function in Win32k is named handle menu messages. You can see it on top. This function calls another one named find window from point. On success, find window from point returns a pointer to a tag window structure. but on failure, it returns -5. The problem lies in the fact that this return value is never checked. So even if -5 is returned, it is treated as a valid pointer to a tag window structure. So what is the attacker doing here? From user mode, they allocate the null page and then set up a structure, a completely valid structure of tag window at address -5. Then they trigger find window from point to return -5 and then send message dereferences this address and treats all the fields in tag window structure as valid. One of the fields in this structure points to the actual shellcode that does the PE for the attacker. How does it gain system privileges? It simply copies the access token of the system process for the current exploit E process. So the exploit runs now with the highest privileges. Later down the road, a new process is created to which the payload image is loaded with system privileges. So what is this payload that runs with full permissions on the MS SQL server now? As I mentioned at the beginning, the payload was one of 12 different payloads that we managed to collect from all the servers that we had access to and all the incidents that we found. Using the compilation time in the binaries, we managed to build a timeline of all the payloads. Now, as you can see, this process spans on a period of around 1 month, or maybe a little more than 1 month. And it looks like the attacker sometimes waits a week before they release a new version of the payload, but sometimes it's a matter of 1 day. So really, for the week ranges, we see some things like adding UPX specking and having more features to the payload. And the 1 day differences we see mostly for bug fixes that we'll see in the end of this talk. Each one of the payloads was written to the registry run key, the famous persistence method, and it dropped 2 additional executables on the machine. One was the crypto miner, and the other was the rootkit. A couple of words on the miner. As I mentioned, there were a couple of differences in the 12 different payloads. An interesting one was the miner that they dropped on the machine. The newest, more recent payloads dropped a file named canlang, which is a compilation of the XMRrig crypto miner. Does anyone here know XMRrig? Heard of it? Okay, very few. XMRrig is an open source CPU crypto miner. It supports many algorithms, it supports many cryptocurrencies, and it's very popular both among attackers and people who mine cryptocurrency on their machines for some reason. The older payloads of the Nanchu campaign dropped a file named DLL-hot, which was a build of JCE miner. And this, in contrast to XMRrig, is a very peculiar looking executable, and it employs very malicious looking techniques. So it's packed, it's obfuscated, it completely looks like a malware. It does process hollowing and injects code into benign Windows processes, for example, attrib.exe, and it communicates from within them, things that we're not used to seeing at all. Apparently, the attacker thought it was a better idea to compile the newer payloads with the open source XMRrig, perhaps to reduce detection. In all cases, the communication was to one of 4 different mining pools, but the attacker kept choosing one cryptocurrency that I'm pretty sure none of you have heard of in the past, which is called Turtle Coin. It's not surprising because Turtle Coin has a very, very tiny market cap of $1 million. And what makes it so attractive for attackers is that it guarantees they remain anonymous. Why? Because all transactions are encrypted and no one can ever know the source and destination wallet addresses participating in a transaction. So these were the miners dropped onto the machine, and now we're going to deep dive into the really interesting rootkit that the attacker used, and Daniel will take it from here.
Okay, so continuing, Ophir described the payload and specifically the miner, but I'm going to describe the rootkit, and with some context that the rootkit, it's not surprising that malware uses rootkits, but it's become more rare on Windows platforms in the last decade as Windows has evolved better defenses against rootkits. And in this case, the attackers use this rootkit to protect the minor executable from impact by security software. In terms of metadata, the rootkit was compiled back in 2016, but when we discovered it, it was pretty much unknown on different antivirus engines and open source repositories that we checked. The strange thing for drivers is that since Windows Vista, Windows requires one simple thing to load drivers, and that is a code signing certificate. Code signing certificates are not so easy to acquire, or at least supposed to be not so easy to acquire, and we've seen them used in malware in pretty much two cases. Either in the hands of nation states, for example, in 2010, Stuxnet used the stolen code signing certificate, or in rare cases where the very high-end criminal groups created shell companies and used those companies to sign their drivers. And yet we see this, a perfectly signed, valid certificate on the name of Hangzhou Hutian Network Technologies, which as far as we can tell is a non-existent company. And they received a code signing certificate from VeriSign that allowed it to sign drivers up until Windows 10. Now, we talked with VeriSign, and they agree with us after checking the records that this code signing certificate was improperly provided, and they revoked it. But at this point, this attacker's been using this for quite a few years. Now, this rootkit was not as easy to research because it's packed and obfuscated. This is rather rare for rootkits, as typically kernel mode code is already sensitive enough, and malicious actors treat it as, okay, this is our most dangerous piece of code, and let's write it as cleanly and as simply as possible. In this case, the rootkit was protected by VM Protect, a very well-known protector. VM Protect covered the entire binary except for a small set of functions. Luckily for us, the IO control code dispatch function and very specific functions that were used as part of the rootkit. From looking at the IO control codes, we saw that there are exactly 19 IO control codes. That means interfaces with the Windows user mode side. But using IRPmon, a driver monitoring tool for Windows, we know only a very few of them were used. The used functionality is very simple. The rootkit has the capability to protect processes from being handled. And what does it mean? It means that the rootkit, after it starts running, our miner is protected from all interference by security or administration software. You can't kill the process, inspect its memory, monitor its file accesses, and so forth. Additionally, there was a lot of unused functionality that I'll go back to later. Around the protecting process functionality, there were a lot of IO control codes. For example, a basic one, an IO control code to add a process ID to an array of protected process IDs to some big array. We can see here with some helpful debug strings, for example, add whitelist process OK was in one of the control codes. Cross-referencing these lists of protected process IDs found them in use by a single callback. We found that this rootkit uses the Windows object callback method to intercept all open operations on processes and threads of all processes in the system. And every access operation would receive the requesting process and the target process or thread, and it would blanket deny all access to these processes unless one of the three criteria was met. One, the request originated from the system process, PID 4, in Windows, which makes sense. Kernel mode, in order to properly function, still needs to access the process. The requesting process identifier is identical to one of the protected ones, which makes sense. A process needs to be able to access itself for a variety of Windows internal API measures that require a valid handle to itself. Or there exists an array of whitelisted PIDs that are allowed to communicate with this process, probably used for inter-process communication, but in our case, this was not used. So knowing this, it was pretty simple to figure out and to write something that unprotects these processes and kills them. The rootkit contained additional mysteries. For example, the usage of x86 in and out instructions to very odd ports. These x86 instructions are used to communicate with physical devices. For example, USB controllers, SATA controllers. And it's not really clear to me why a high-level rootkit wants to use that. More specifically, we saw functions with two options. One is for every process ID that answers some specific predicate, there's a message sent to the keyboard controller, port IO port number 64. This is not something that makes a lot of sense for server rootkits. There's typically not a keyboard connected, nor what do they really need to activate lights. More strangely, there was an additional communication with port 1004, which I'm not sure what it is used for. It's not used in any virtualization software I'm familiar with or with any hardware. So if anybody actually knows, I'd be glad to know after the talk. Additionally, there were many other unused octels. And what we're figuring out from this is that, again, as Ophir mentioned before, this is not something the attackers wrote for themselves. This seems way beyond their capabilities. But this is something that they just found lying around on the internet with some basic manual of how to use. We tried to zoom out and figure out where does this root can come from, and we see it had a very robust development process. There are lookup tables for pretty much every Windows version this driver can run on, 7, 8, 8.1, and multiple Windows 10 builds, including beta builds. For those of us who ended up writing low-level software in our lives, they know that this is not that simple to collect such a library of every version of the software you want to test, including beta versions. So behind the scenes here, there's at least an organized group developing this rootkit. We tried to figure out where this rootkit comes from, and we found very few indicative strings that we listed here on the side. For example, there's a QQ number, which is a popular Chinese instant messaging program. There's SA6482, which was the user mode name given to this driver. And the last one is Madame Du SA8.2. Googling variations of these names found a similar rootkit from a decade ago, targeting Windows XP and Windows Server 2003, 32-bit. Again, obfuscated with the same technique, but this time the protection for these processes was based around SSDT, System Service Dispatch Table hooking. At this point, we're pretty much left with, we're not exactly sure where this rootkit came from, but we are aware that it's very much, it's very powerful and has more capabilities than what the attacker did with it. So we talked a bit about the payloads, and I want to talk a bit about the scope and a bit about the victims. So as I mentioned before, that we had access to the attacker's file server. We couldn't execute code or change anything there, but we could read data. And we could use the download counts. And we use the download counts for two purposes. One is, by sampling the server every few hours, we could pretty much track a real-time view of how often the attackers spread. We can see there are periods of very low activity, where they basically had very few victims, and some peaks of activity, maybe when they were running specific scanners or specific successful IP ranges. The two bars we have here, the blue one, if you can see that the higher one is downloads of the exploits, and the orange is the consolidated payloads. And we can see that they pretty much line up, so it means our theory matches up with what we saw in the different log files. And also that we can see the blue line is slightly higher. We had some attacks where they managed to successfully download the exploit, but not successfully download the payload, meaning this attack was wasted. Additionally, we could track simply the amount of victims, and we saw that inside 1 month, the attacks went from 24,000 victims to nearly 48,000, a near doubling inside 1 month, and this is tracking only MSSQL, the MSSQL attack flow. So there's a lot more unprotected servers than we would prepare to assume in 2019 on the internet. This is a lot of servers running high-end software that are vulnerable to password 1, password 2, and so forth. For privacy reasons, we're not going to list the victims, but we found log files listing different names, and where we could, we reversed IP looked up and found out, and we saw many businesses, obviously many small and medium businesses and telecommunication hosting companies, but also many municipalities and government organizations. We found mayor's offices, water supply companies, hospitals, all running. So despite the thought that this would only catch honeypots, we found a lot more victims. Now to wrap this up.
Okay, so to conclude a little bit of what we saw here in the last half an hour, we named the talk "The Turtle's Gone Ninja." We hope that at this point it's a little bit clearer why. We're seeing here a common criminal attack which aims for crypto mining. But along this attack, the attackers chose to use things that we are used to seeing used by nation-state level groups and APT groups and not common criminals. We have two versions of a privilege escalation Windows kernel exploit. We have a signed rootkit, which is completely non-usual for these types of attacks. And I think what this means is that common criminals today are getting much stronger, their arsenals are growing wider, and they shouldn't be underestimated because they totally manage to get what they want. However, I promised some bugs that we found on the way with this attack flow. So we can see two examples here. At the beginning, the attackers wrote an invalid IP address to the 2.vbs script, if you remember it. This is where they're trying to download the exploit, but this will definitely not work since this is an invalid IP, and this completely stops the attack flow from proceeding. Another confusion that we saw along the research was how the attackers incorrectly ran the crypto miner on the machine. On the left, you can see how the crypto miner should be executed with the U flag for wallet address and the P for credentials. But our attacker ran it with a switched order of parameters, and this, of course, yielded exactly 0 turtle coin for the Nanshu attacker. Regarding attribution, we do not know who this attack group is, but as you've seen yourselves, there was Chinese all over the place. We had file names, we had directories like the Chuan directory. We saw executables compiled with easy programming language in the Chinese development environment. And also, we managed to find Chinese HFS, HTTP file servers belonging to the attackers. So these all hint that this is a China-based group. Now regarding mitigation, I apologize for stating the obvious, but these are things that should be spoken of. So the Nanshu campaign managed to infect 50,000 servers because machines today still use password 1234 as a security guard. Also, the exploits managed to run on these systems because they were unpatched. Systems today do not have the most recent security patches, which enables such attacks to operate successfully on them. And last but not least, isolation and segmentation. We need to know our networks well enough. We need to know exactly which machines are internet facing, because these probably are not 50,000 MSSQL and PHP MyAdmin servers, which should be internet facing. MSSQL servers should be served internally inside the organization and not face the internet. If you'd like to read a little more on this attack campaign, we have a full blog post that we wrote in the Guardicore Labs website that you can read by scanning the QR code. And also we had a GitHub repository with all IOCs, indicators of compromise, a detection script in PowerShell, and this is it. And one more thing that I'd like to mention, we talked a bit about the GSN, the Global Sensors Network. We expose all the honeypot data in a cyber threat intelligence portal that you can access using this QR code or the URL. We have a weekly update of all the IPs that we see attacking, and all the domains that we see, and the full attack flows of each attacker IP, and a lot of other information pieces for you to observe free. I think I was told we're supposed to take questions downstairs and not now, but we'd like to thank you for being here and listening, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Questions? We have some more time for questions.
Hi. Earlier during the attack flow slides, you mentioned the kind of port scanners that the attackers use. How do you know that?
Okay, so the answer to that is, as Ophir mentioned, when we had access to the attacker infrastructure, we found the different port scan modules in the lists. And what we could see was a matchup of, before the attack flow, we could see, for example, our honeypots access to different ports that came from these same IPs. And also we saw a complete matchup of the attack flow, like, okay, they give 5 port numbers here, the scan was for 5 port numbers, and the log files contain the exact same results. So we speculate that this is the flow.
I'd like to also add to this question that even after a breach, attackers sometimes use the compromised machine to scan and infect more machines. So we actually see what binaries they compile to their payloads, and we see masking and nmap many times.
More questions? And thanks a lot.
Again.